and dragged himself through the narrow gap. When he got his feet under him and looked around, he discovered he was in Kesk's stables. Horses and mules eyed him from their stalls, but no red axes were in view. Evidently, the kegs hadn't made enough of a racket to attract attention. He held the hatch for Mary while she wriggled free. She pointed at a door that apparently led to the main body of the mansion. He gave her a nod. The interior of the sprawling house was gloomy. Only a few of the lamps were burning, and due to the mild autumn weather, most of the hearths were cold. Still enough light shone for even human eyes to make out the dirt and other signs of neglect, and naturally, the dimness did nothing to cover up the smell of mildew. Neither Aaron nor his father was much of a housekeeper. That had been his mother's province until she passed away unexpectedly in her sleep, worn out perhaps by worrying over her son's embrace of the outlaw life and her husband's infirmities. But then again, he'd never lived anywhere fancy, and his own slovenly habits notwithstanding. He still felt a twinge of disgust at Kesk for letting such a palace gradually crumble into ruin. But what matters was that the mansion was quiet. Aaron knew it wasn't deserted. The Tanaruk wouldn't have left his coffers of gold and stores of loot and contraband entirely unguarded. But from the sound of it, most of the red axes were off hunting. Aaron or standing watch over their various interests throughout the city, and that meant his scheme might actually work. "Which way?" Mary whispered. He shook his head and replied, "I've never been inside here before. They could be keeping my father anywhere. We just have to look." They skulked on, keeping to the shadows, cracking open doors to check the rooms on the other side. The damp river air had warped some of them, making them stick in their frames, and the intruders had to force them open. The resulting squeaks and rasps jangled Aaron's nerves. They didn't raise an alarm, however, and as the minutes passed without calamity, Aaron started to feel the old familiar thrill. He was still frightened for Nikos and for himself, come to that, but it was nonetheless a delight to outwit his opponents in the game a burglar played, to trespass where he wasn't allowed and do what wasn't permitted. In time, he and Mary found a staircase leading to the cellars. "Maybe the red axes have their own little dungeon," the scout suggested. Aaron thought about it for a second, listening to the same instincts that had led him to many a hidden cubbyhole or a closet filled with valuables. "It's possible," he said, "but they wouldn't need to lock my father in his cell to keep him under control. Feeble as he is, a bit of rope would do the job, and I reckon Kesk would prefer to keep him close by. That way, they could hear him whenever he felt the urge without the bother of trampling up and down the stairs. So we need to find where Kesk spends the majority of his time, which will be the most lavish part of the house." They prowled on, and in time caught sight of a wide marble staircase sweeping upward. Pathway up, a bravo sat on one of the steps, picking something out of his shaggy, tangled beard. At the top, tall double doors, inlaid with a stylish scene of a river, boats, leaping fish, and spindling-legged wading birds, stood open. Aaron and Mary retreated back into the shadows before the red axe could spot them. "That looks like it could be it," the ranger said. If you'd let me keep my bow, perhaps he should have, but it was too uncommon a weapon in Weevil. It had marked her almost as well as her green leather armor. You still couldn't count on picking that fellow off without making some noise, Aaron said. Maybe we can find a back way in. A big room in a rich man's house is likely to have at least 2 doors, one for the masters and one for the flunkies. She gave him a nod and said, "Lead on." It didn't take long to find the servants' stairs spiraling up and down in a claustrophobic shaft. The risers were narrow. The way all but lightless, and the trap air was stale. Aaron wondered how many maids and valets had taken a nasty tumble back when the house was young. He caught his first glimpse of the chamber at the top, and it drove such casual speculations from his mind. The long hall was a solar, one-wall, continuous row of windows intended to admit sunlight and provide a panoramic view of the sculptor. Nikos sat tied in a chair, his eyes closed and his head lolling. His chest rose and fell, reassuring proof that he was only unconscious, not dead. In fact, apart from the mutilation of his hand, he didn't look as badly injured as Aaron had expected. Unfortunately, the prisoner wasn't alone. The big gilded chair in which Kesk no doubt liked to sit was currently vacant, but Theric, the orc who accompanied the bugbear to Emery's warehouse, and a human outlaw were hanging around. Moreover, one of the glass panes had shattered, and a small man with a wool scarf masking the lower portion of his face stood before the breach, evidently because it afforded a clearer view than the cracked, filthy windows that remained intact. Gazing through a brass astrolabe, he alternately scrutinized the night sky and scratched his observation on a slate. A green mantle and gold knob blackwood cane rested on a little table beside him. Aaron wondered if the astrologer was also a magician and had supplied the red axes with the metal mantis and potion of invulnerability that had nearly cost him and Mary their lives. If so, he was likely to prove more clever and dangerous than the common ruffians. Mary tugged on Aaron's arms, and they sneaked back down the steps a little way, where they could whisper without fear of being overheard. "How fast can you throw your knives?" she asked. "Not fast enough to kill 4 men before one of them yells for help. I think it's time to test these disguises." She stared at him as if he'd gone mad. Maybe he had. "I figured that at best they'd only work at a distance," the ranger said. "I mean, I've seen half orcs. We don't look right." "Close enough, maybe, if no one peers too closely," Aaron replied. "A disguise is half attitude in the way you carry yourself. We have the advantage that the red axes never expected us to sneak in here. I'm sure of that much. Besides, if they recognize us and we wind up having to fight, it won't be any worse than if we started out that way." "Yes, it will. We'll have lost the advantage of surprise." She frowned and continued. "Still, Nikos is your father, and it was your tactics that got us this far. If you're sure you want to try it this way, I'll follow you. I'll follow your lead." "Thanks. Let me do the talking." They climbed back up the stairs, making no particular effort to do so quietly. The risers creaked. When the red axes glanced in his direction, Aaron felt a split second of panic, of certainty that the greenish pigment on his skin, the black dye in his hair, and the absence of his goatee wouldn't fool anyone. He slouched on into the room anyway, praying that his cowl cast his features into shadow. Kesk's operation was large and varied enough to make it unlikely that all his minions knew one another well, but it was possible they'd all laid eyes on one another at least a time or two. Aaron grunted one of the orc greetings he'd picked up over the years, then ambled to Nikos with Miri following along behind. He crouched beside his father's chair and started untying him. The old man came awake with a start. "Hey," Thurok said, "what are you doing?" "What's it look like?" Aaron replied in his best imitation of a surly goblinkin voice. He kept his hands bowed over his work. "It looks like you're undoing the rope," Thurok said. "I know you could figure it out if you strained hard enough," Aaron replied. "Look, Kesk's sick of having this old man up here all the time. He wants us to stick him somewhere else. You don't think we're going to carry him in the chair too, do you? Not as long as he can walk." The hulking bugbear blinked its green-red pupiled eyes and asked, "Kesk's back?" "He couldn't give orders if he wasn't. Now could he?" He said he'll be up here in a minute, as soon as he checks some things that came in through the underway. The last knot yielded, and Aaron jerked Nikos to his feet. Mary grabbed hold of the hostage's forearm, and they wrenched him around towards the servants' door. For a couple of steps, no one protested, and Aaron felt a surge of exultation that he and Mary were actually getting away with it. Then a mild, baritone voice said, "Please, hold on for just a moment." It had to be the astrologer. No one else in the room would speak in that educated accent. For want of a better idea, Aaron and Mary ignored him and kept on moving. "Excuse me," said the man in the scarf, raising his voice a little. Brilliant white blazed through the air. Startled, the red axes shouted and cursed the intruders. The intruders spun around, only to discover they didn't need to defend themselves. The flare of light had been simply that, not a sign they were under mystical assault. Not yet. It had been a warning the wizard could attack them if they refused to heed him. "What?" Aaron growled. "Do any of you fellows know these two?" the small man asked. "Look closely." At some point over the course of the past couple minutes, he tossed his cloak over his shoulders and picked up his cane. "We rob travelers along the river," Mary said, making her voice coarse. "We don't get into town much." "That may be," said the magician, "but I'm going to ask the same thing of you that I did of Dark Sister Sephir's. Show me your brands." Aaron pulled back his sleeve to display the false scarf he'd shaped from crimson candle wax. "Nice," the wizard chuckled through his Leinster scarf, "but not quite convincing enough. You're the man himself, aren't you, Aaron Sar Randall? Even bolder than your reputation led me to believe, I think." Aaron whipped an Artham fang from its sheath and hurled it at the Arcanist's chest. The knife hit the target, but clanked and rebounded. The small man had some magical protection in place that kept it from penetrating. A crossbow streaked at Mary. She shielded herself with her buckler, then turned to face the human Red Axe, who was charging her with a dagger in either hand. She drew her broadsword and cut in a single motion, ripping open the outlaw's belly. His knees buckled and he dropped. "If you Red Axes have any of my talismans or elixirs," the astrologer shouted, "use them." He backed away, putting distance between himself and the intruders. It was evident though Forson wasn't entirely impervious to harm, but Aaron was more interested in getting away than in trying to hurt him. He considered a leap out of the broken window, but feared Nikos wouldn't survive the fall into the river, that even if he did, he couldn't manage the frantic swim for safety afterward. He shouted, "Down the stairs, father. We'll follow." Nikos spat in obscenity. Plainly, frail as he was, it still irked him to flee while other folk risked their lives to cover his retreat. But he tottered backwards as quickly as his weakness allowed. No doubt, drawn by the commotion, the Red Axe with the long, matted beard appeared in the doorway at the far end of the hall. Half concealed behind Thurag, the wizard chanted and swept whatever it was he held between thumb and forefinger through a mystic pass. Standing closest to Aaron, Mary, and Nikos, the bugbear and orc gulped the contents of tiny bottles. Aaron threw a knife at Thurag. The creature wrenched himself sideways, and the blade pierced his forearm instead of his chest. A painful wound, perhaps, but it wouldn't stop the creature. An instant later, Thurag's body swelled, becoming bigger and likely stronger than an ogre. His clothing and gear grew with him, though, for some reason, Aaron's dagger didn't. The process of enlargement shoved it out of the wound to fall and clank on the floor. Thurag raised his cudgel, bellowed a battle cry, and rushed the human who'd hurt him. Huge as the bugbear was, his head nearly brushed the high ceiling. He seemed as terrible an opponent as the brass mantis. Aaron was surely he lacked the strength to parry a blow from the heavy club, so he dodged the first vicious stroke instead. He told himself it was just possible that, by drinking the potion, Thurag had outsmarted himself. At his present size, the Red Axe wouldn't be able to pursue his foes down the servants' stairs. Nikos cried out in dismay. Hard pressed though he was, Aaron risked a glance. Aaron risked a glance over his shoulder. A mesh of slimy gray cables, stinky enough to adhere to the walls, floors, and ceiling, sealed the entrance to the narrow steps, as if a gigantic spider had spun a web there. Obviously, the man with the blackwood cane had conjured the strands to cut off the intruder's retreat. Mary and the orc circled one another near Kesk's throne. The Red Axe opened his mouth wide and seemingly spat out its own tongue. The pink flesh flew through the air, meanwhile stretching into a cord, a dozen feet long. It slapped and whirled around the startled ranger's legs, yanking her off balance and binding her to the heavy chair. The orc sprang at her with its short sword leveled to pierce her belly. Aaron wanted to rush to her aid, but it was impossible. He didn't dare ignore his own opponent. He hastily faced forward, and Thurag swung the cudgel down like a man splitting wood. Aaron dodged, the weapon clashed against the floor. Maybe Aaron could hamstring the goblinkin before he could lift the stick for another stroke. He sprang in close, only to find that Thurag had anticipated the move. The bugbear's boot lashed out at him. Aaron tried to dodge, but the brutal kick still struck him a glancing blow. That was enough to smash the breath from his lungs and send him staggering. As he did, he caught a glimpse of Mary, still alive, but still bound as well. The orc was trying to stab her from behind, and she was only barely able to twist around far enough to fend him off. Snowballs pelted her. Plainly, it was another conjuration, one that looked almost comical, though it was evident from the way she jerked that the white barrage inflicted actual pain. The orc lunged, and once again she managed to turn its blade with her buckler. Her repulsive, however, was a feeble, fumbling action, easily avoided. In fact, it looked like she almost lost her grip on her broadsword. Nikos had picked up a bronze cuspidor to use as a makeshift bludgeon, then limped to intercept the Red Axe with the unkempt whiskers. The old man had been a formidable brawler in his day, but it was obvious from the way Nikos moved that without sufficient strength or agility to back them up, his rusty skills no longer posed a threat. The Red Axe thought so too, leering he advanced with his guard lowered, daring Nikos to strike at him. Two more ruffians appeared in the far doorway. Therog rushed in. Aaron flailed his arms and recovered his balance just in time to dodge the next sweep of the bugbear's cudgel. It was hard to imagine, it muttered. He, his father, and Mary might last a little while longer, but the red axes were inevitably going to prevail. Perching atop a gable slate roof overlooking Kesk's mansion, Seppris peered down, watching for Aaron and Mary, while munching on a old toasted roll with a greasy sausage and apple filling. She'd bought food and a canteen because she'd known she might have to remain at her post for hours before the red-bearded thief made his play. Indeed, it was possible that Aaron wouldn't try to rescue Nikos at all, but Seppris considered that unlikely. He'd be eager to retrieve the old man before the red axes snipped off any more pieces. She was certain that, after confusing the gang with raids throughout the city, Aaron meant to invade their stronghold. No other plan would give Mary a reason to work with him. The difficulty was predicting how the pair would try to enter the building, theoretically accessible from the skelter, at ground level and via the underways. After some thought, Seppris had ruled out the river. Kesk had found the patch in the breach in the portcullis defending the water gate. Anyway, it was unlikely that Aaron would attempt the same approach twice. The underways also seemed an implausible choice. She'd seen that the passage connected the cellars to the lawless tunnels was well fortified, and Aaron surely had some inkling of that. That left advancing up the street and across the yard. Kesk undoubtedly had a sentry on watch and kept his doors and windows locked, but Aaron would trust in his ability to avoid detection by the former, and tease open the latter. For after all, it was his trade. The lawns and gardens surrounded the mansion were overgrown and weed-infested. Slinking about just after sunset, Seppris had cast spells of warning on the best hiding places. If a second intruder used those choice bits of cover to sneak up on the house, she'd sense it. Then she climbed up on top of the neighboring building to wait. In time, another watcher's attention might have wandered, but her teachers had trained her to suppress boredom as efficiently as any other emotion. She gazed down at Kesk's residence as patiently as a python hanging in a tree waiting for prey to happen along beneath. Yet even so, she almost missed the light, for it was just a momentary flicker at the peripheral of her vision. By the time her head snapped around towards the north and the river was already gone, she wondered what the pale radiance had been, the moon peeking momentarily from behind a cloud. No, the sky was clear that night, and saloon, her tears, and the stars had shone brightly right along. It must have been magical then. Firelight wouldn't be so white, nor could it blaze and die so quickly. Maybe a priest or sorcerer out sailing or on the far shore had cast a spell that kindled a momentary glow, but she wondered about Kesk's employer. The last time she'd seen the wretch, it had been in the cellar of the opposite side of the house. Suppose he lingered there still, and his magic had produced the flare. The light could have pulsed out the long row of windows and reflected off the surface of the river. Maybe, but even if the masked wizard had used his art, it didn't have to be because he was engaged in a confrontation with Aaron or Randall. Zephyrus strained, listening to shouting and clash of blades against shields, or some other sign of strife. All she heard was the constant murmur of the city around her. Still, over the course of the next minute or so, she felt a growing certainty that somehow Aaron and Mary had slipped past her and into the house. Either they'd freed Nikos and made their escape, or more likely the Red Axes would kill the scout and take their fellow outlaw prisoner. However it worked out, it could result in the Black Bouquet passing beyond Zephyrus's grasp forever. That was unacceptable. She hoped to capture Aaron before he had a chance to enter the mansion. Not make another foray into a place she'd fled with some difficulty the night before, but she saw no alternative. She sprang off the edge of the roof, snatching and releasing the irregularities in the walls to slow her plummeting descent. When she hit the ground, the impact jolted her but did no real harm. She rolled to her feet and charged the house. Given a choice, she would once again have skulked up in hopes of remaining undetected, but she felt speed was more important. Nobody shouted or sent a quarrel or sling stone flying in her direction. She was certain Kesks routinely posted a sentry, but if she was right, if something was happening inside the house, perhaps it had already diverted the guards' attention. The primary entrance was a pair of massive double doors. Neither their solid weight nor the intricacy of the lock would have hindered her spell of opening, but she begrudged even the moment it would take to stop and recite the incantation. She raced up the wide steps, leaped into the air, and thrust kicked at the juncture of the panels, attacking it as if her entire body was a battering ram. The door buckled in the frame and something crunched. Zephyrus rebounded and fell onto the porch. She scrambled to her feet and kicked a second time. The two leaves flew apart.